Okay, hello. So as we pick up from part one, we're thinking about what Fanon lays out in decolonization. What is it? And it is really going to alter society, right? So when he says it's a total disorder, it means it's a reconfiguration of society. And the last shall be first, of course, has biblical implications for those of you familiar. But what does this mean, right? And this is a sentiment that was echoed also famously by many revolutionary figures around the planet. But in Ireland, when this became a mantra, that the last shall be the first, right? Ireland shall be free, namely figures like Bobby Sands and the hunger strikers um, use this to think about how that world would be reordered or disordered and reordered, right? So as we're moving through how when Fanon's when we see the language of pure violence, right? The agent does not alleviate oppression or mass domination. He displays and demonstrates them with clear conscience of the law enforcer and brings violence into the homes and the minds of the colonized subject. So thinking about how state violence becomes legitimate and is lived every single day. And we here in our period kind of naturalize a lot of the violences that are perpetrated by the state or in the name of the state, whether it is here at home or whether it is abroad with bombs and missiles and other forms of violence, or economic forms of violence, or embargoes starving nations and peoples across the planet. But so that is what we would call state violence. But we here really don't see that because it's well obfuscated with different forms of longing or legitimation of those forms of state violence. For example, one example comes to mind is the Cuban embargo that's been in place since the 1960s, right, to the present. People are suffering, are denied certain access to certain goods, food, medicine, although they do pretty well with their medical, one of the best medical systems in the world. But the United States is condemned every year by the United Nations for this inhumane embargo upon a nation, a tiny nation like Cuba. But that's not really in our purview, right? But that is violence. People are dying, and there's a correlation there, or denied certain aspects, or live a certain lifestyle, not due to just what's going on domestically, but in fact sometimes caused by the forms of imperial violence. And how, when Fanon is thinking about the context of colonialism, right? And he says the singularity of the colonial context lies in the fact that economic reality, inequality, and enormous disparities in lifestyles never managed to mask the human reality. Looking at the immediacies of the colonial context, it is clear that what divides this world is first and foremost what species, what race one belongs to. In the colonies, the economic infrastructure is also a superstructure. So here he's taking up some of the terms that we learned previously from Marx and Engels. Recall the base is the economic system, capitalism. The superstructure is everything else in society, civil society, all the knowledge. Think of all the air we breathe, the knowledge, the epistemological air that we breathe, right? In a superstructure. And here he's centering, not only conducting a class analysis, but now expanding it to include race is central in how class formations are crystallized, right? So the cause is the effect. You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich. This is why a Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched when it comes to addressing the colonial issue, right? And it's not as simply as saying race equates class, but he's doing this to draw a distinction into how Europe took apart Africa and colonized it during that scramble for Africa in the 19th century, right? So not only as a Marxist, you don't only think through society and the economic system as, oh, the working class as one homogenous group, the working class, the proletariat. Now you have to include these other factors, right? Race is central. So thinking to the United States and working class formations of the United States and organizing under labor unions. Well, there were some labor unions in the initial moment. The American Federation of Labor was exclusively white, right? So it's that though class consciousness was really solidifying, you excluded black workers or other races of workers. Right? So how would you think about as we're thinking through these ideas in Fanon, how would we think about the world as it is separated between these dichotomous forces, right, of colonization, decolonization, and that condition of coloniality, which I will expand on in a moment. So, challenging the colonial world is not a rational confrontation of viewpoints. It is not a discourse on the universal, but the impassioned claim by the colonized that their world is fundamentally different. The colonial world is a Manichaean world. The colonist is not content with physically limiting the space of the colonized, that is, with the help of his agents of law and order, as if to illustrate the totalitarian nature of colonial exploitation. The colonist turns to the colonized, right? So, how does one emerge and claim that I am human, right? They know that they are human, but they had been already dehumanized. So how does that happen? And here are some of the elements on how one streams from human to animal and now back, right? And if we think of the rhetoric used in all the thinkers, going way back, even to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or now what we know of John Locke and his involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, the rationalization, the depiction of the so-called savage or people of color around the world, right? So now these folks begin to develop the weapons in order to decolonize, right? And just to give you this concept of coloniality, I just want to pause here for a moment because this notion of coloniality, what Nelson Maldonado Torres tells us, depicts long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations, which is based on the idea of race. Right? So this concept here helps us think about, even after decolonization movements are quote unquote successful, they become liberated, India is free, Algeria is free, all these territories are free. How are there still these patterns of domination that exist on the ground? Economically speaking, epistemologically speaking, domination over labor. How is the world still structured hierarchically even after, say, the British flag goes down and the Indian flag comes up? The British colonial administration now leaves back to London, but yet that power over India still remains, economically speaking, and in other forms. And how this helps us explain how, to the present, certain peoples who are marked by that idea of race continue to be dominated the world over in all these realms. Right? So I want to move to the question of land, because land is central as we've been moving, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau pointed out on the origins of inequality. That is the premise, as John Locke before him eloquated, that this is how hierarchies begin to be developed, right, with that acquisition of private property through one's labor. But how that tie, if one does not have the tie to the land, one is relegated to simply working for the land and the landowner, right? So, and here are some page numbers on the PDF that you can go to, but the imagination is central, right, to the colonized subject, to develop a consciousness. And I just want to go to this last sentence that Fanon points to. During colonization, the colonized subject frees himself night after night between 9 in the evening and 6 in the morning, because the rest of that time under subjugation. And think about this. One is only free when they are asleep, when we can imagine, when we can dream of the possibilities of a different future, or maybe even have nightmares that might ignite the idea or give us those moments of clarity that will shake us up and wake us up. Figuratively in our sleep to awaken, but also literally to awaken in our society and developing that consciousness. So this is how this occurs, right? And here are the page numbers you can go through as you're thinking about these questions, right? So the unity on class or nation, right? How does this develop? And here are some more passages that we're thinking about this. And think about this as we're thinking through, the violence of the moment that we talked about. And this notion of coloniality, what Walter Mignolo calls the dark side of modernity, right? The truth is, we must not accept such conditions. We must refuse outright the situation to which the West wants to condemn us. Colonialism and imperialism have not settled their debt to us once they have withdrawn their flag and their police from our territories. This was the notion I was posing earlier on the example of England and India. Domination is still occurring there, right? So as we're moving towards thinking about how violence is thought through, is theorized in relation to the violence of the nation state. How does that process work itself through that requires the work and the effort in order for one to become human? And for Frantz Fanon, he gives us a clear explication, right? And here, this passage on decolonization, the Third World has no intention of organizing a vast hunger crusade against Europe. What it does expect from those who have kept it in slavery for centuries is to help it rehabilitate man and ensure his triumph everywhere once and for all. Remember, as we began this talk, Fanon thinking and believing that Europe was still capable of becoming fully human themselves, right? Because they were able to speak of it. Think of the ideas from the Enlightenment and rationality. Man is the measure of all things. But yet not every man. But for Fanon, he still espoused that belief and that view that they could come to that conclusion and will include the Third World. But it is obvious we are not so naive as to think this will be achieved with the cooperation and goodwill of European governments. This colossal task, which consists of reintroducing man, central, into the world. Man in his totality will be achieved with the crucial help of the European masses, who would do well to confess that they have often rallied behind the position of our common masters on the colonial issues. In order to do this, the European masses must first of all decide to wake up, put on their thinking caps, and stop playing the irresponsible game of Sleeping Beauty or just